And I remember her standing at the top of that stairway and saying to me, "We're at war," like that. And I had no idea. That was December 7th, 1941. First of all, I was an only child, which had a pretty neat existence for someone with mother and dad both worked, and I learned to take care of myself pretty well. My earliest remembrance is that my dad was laid up. He had been a steel worker in a building of downtown Chicago, the Palm Olive building and things like that, 20 and 30-story buildings. And he was laid up with serious leg problems, and my mother had to go to work. And so I went to a boarding school at the age of 5. It was St. Joseph's Academy in LaGrange, Illinois. And sometimes I wouldn't see my mother and dad for a couple weeks. But I understood it from a standpoint. It was the Depression was on, and anyone that could work, worked. And it was a necessary thing, and I understood it as a young boy, 6 years old or so. And it taught me self-sufficiency in a way that, I don't know, it just was part of my life. My grandmother had gone through World War I, had sons in World War I, and I just remember, and it's like yesterday, she's standing up about 10 feet away from me, maybe not that far. And I came in from playing football, and she said to me, "We're at war," like that. And wow, it got, because she had sons that served in World War I. I was probably, no, about 19 and a half, probably. I enlisted a month before the draft took place in the U.S. And then went overseas, and we had a chance to volunteer for the Airborne, and I did. I enlisted and selected my branch of service because I was going to go. I wanted to be a mechanical engineer, and so I enlisted in enlisted in the Corps of Engineers, thinking that yep, that's where I'd go. Well, it was a long time before I ever saw anything about being a mechanical engineer. I volunteered for the 101st directly. My buddy, Ellie Chase, we both had what they call MOSs, which is the skill level, or what you were capable. And our MOS was for electricians. We had gone to electrical school. They offered both of us a commission, a corporal's commission immediately, which was pretty good. And Ellie took that, and he went to the 82nd and was an electrician, and went all the way to Berlin and sold Mickey Mouse watches to the Russians. And I went to the 101st and saw combat almost immediately. That was a big attraction to people because that was double what you were getting in paid. You know, in fact, it was more than double because it was an extra $50 a month. And at that time, I think the Army was still at $35, but they were heading toward 50 at that time, but it wasn't there yet. And not only that, my feeling of it, and that's the way it stays in my mind today, I was with a bunch of guys that were serious about winning World War II. The training that we had was diabolical. Jump school sergeants, as I said, they weren't really interested in all the training they were going to give you. They were interested in the fact that, or the realization that you were going to go to combat and make parachute jumps into enemy territory, and that's what they wanted. They wanted to know if you were going to chicken out in the door, freeze in the door, as they call it, which is, and that was a very real thing. I can remember a guy in front of me in our training jump in England went out the door and grabbed onto the, can you imagine this? Grabbed onto the floor of the plane and hung on the outside of the plane with his bare hands. That's how afraid he was. You know, I still remember the jump school sergeant going over and going, bam, bam, with his jump boot on the guy's fingers, and he let go and went on, and you know, the parachute opened because they all opened automatically and so forth. But it was a long time when you went out of the plane before your parachute blossomed, and in those milliseconds of time, you were saying, "Come on, baby, open." In my case, I had a guy land on top of my chute after my chute had opened, and he came on and landed and walked across the top of my parachute. And I was yelling at him, slip away, and finally he literally jumped off of my chute and slid down the side of the chute and out, and then we both landed in the field. So. One night we were talking, my friend and I, and he said, you know, they're coming through to take volunteers to go into the airborne. And one of the things was, first of all, you got $50 an extra a month for pay. But the other thing is you went directly to a unit. You weren't a replacement. And so we went down to the company day room and we volunteered. And I went to the 101st because in those days you became a member of the 101st, and then you went through jump school, where otherwise, you know, God knows where you would end up before you'd ever get assigned to a unit. And I was lucky. You know, I got to E Company at a 506, and you know, that ended up to be the Band of Brothers, and it's changed my life. And as I look back at it now, that experience has been incredible as far as my life story goes. We got into Bastogne, I think the 17th or 18th. The breakthrough started on a Sunday during the day, and we got word that the breakthrough had happened, and our sergeants came through late that night, and the next morning we fell out and went started to go to Bastogne in open trucks. And that was an experience because it was raining, snowing, sleeting, and we were well, you live around here, you see grain trucks. That's what we were hauled in for about 24 hours. So packed that if we went around a corner, everybody would lean to that side because you couldn't fall over. There were too many guys in there. We had all of our equipment and everything. And when we got to Bastogne, didn't know where we were, but we got to the corner and the signpost is still there. Bastogne this way, Foy that way. We jumped off the trucks. And the first thing we saw was 2 divisions, American divisions, in retreat, running. Some had rifles, some had no overcoats, 2 guys carrying 1 guy on a rifle sling. We saw our American Army in retreat. And our officers knew immediately they weren't prepared for that. And they were grabbing the guys, stopping them, and if they didn't have a weapon, they jammed a weapon in them and put them together and started to try and begin to offer resistance. But when I stood at that point, when we jumped off the trucks, we could see Americans running away from the enemy. It was, I hope as an American, I never have to ever see an American Army in retreat, and that's what we did. Luckily, Airborne is, as I can remember our company commander saying, "Okay, guys, we're surrounded. That's what we usually are. Let's go." And that, of course, that was the Esprit de Corps that lived with us in the Airborne, and that still exists today. That's a camaraderie and an appreciation of one another that we still have today. And even though there are only 19 left of us in E Company. This is probably one of the few companies that can talk about this or say anything about it. They came together on June 1st, 1942, and served under the same company commander the whole war. Major winners. The guys loved them. And why I was so lucky to get assigned to a company like that. And of course, Airborne had a esprit de corps that didn't exist in the normal Army. We had a guy in the company that if the firefight wasn't hot enough in the area he was in, he'd go looking for the place where the combat was a little more intense. And that was the way the Airborne thought. And I guess today I think I look back and I think, well, it sort of shaped my personality to some degree. Off to our right, well, the road that were dumped at was an intersection of a road that ran outside of Bastogne into the Beaujacques woods. And it's heavy, heavy pine trees. In fact, there was no separation between the boughs of the pine trees. They came together. So when you went into the forest, it was pitch black. There was hardly any light that came through. And that's where we began to dig our holes, and we stayed there almost that entire time that we were in Bastogne. But then Patton broke through to us, and we were they still stayed in the holes that were there that we had dug, but then they were pulled out on about the 20th of January. The Battle of Bastogne was over with, and they broke out and went on to further combat. We were up on a hill outside the Bulge woods, and I had been detailed to go to a foxhole that had two guys in it before it had a direct hit by a mortar shell. And so I went there, and another guy and I picked up what was left of them, put them on a stretcher, and were taking them back to Graves Registration, which was the gruesome part of some of the combat things that people don't talk about. And this new unit, a tank unit, right fresh from the States, they had landed in Antwerp earlier that day, which was about 60 miles away. And they came in, and the tanks were we were on just below the brow of a little hill. And these tanks came in and parked right up in back of us. Well, this kid lit a cigarette. It was black. There was no moon. There were a few stars. You couldn't see anything, and he lit a cigarette. And within about 30 seconds, wham! .188 came right in. Killed 4 guys, wounded a whole bunch of guys, including myself. I got wounded. A shell fragment hit my right femur on the side and the thigh and went right through both legs. Shattered my bones in my femurs. I spent 9 months flat on my back in bed because of that one lit cigarette. Now, that kid that lit that cigarette, if anyone could have seen him, for sure, he would have been killed by one of our guys. There was no question. The guys were standing up, and because the hill was a little bit above us, they were standing up with their rifles looking at where the hell that kid sat down with that cigarette and lit it. I can remember the medic, because I was laying there, and the medic went around and he said, "This one's dead, this one's dead, this one's dead." And I think he said it 4 times, and the 5th time he said, "This one's alive." And I came into that, because by that time I had been hit when that shell went off. Well, they put me in a pile of snow first. That's what saved my life. But part of it tore off this whole underside of my leg here is gone. Why I am as mobile as I am today, I can't figure it out, but I am lucky. Well, they scared the hell out of me first, because I was laying on the table, and the doctors were standing there all scrubbed. Boy, I could picture that. I think I could almost see what their uniforms looked like and things like that. And I said, they were all scrubbed, and the medic was standing off to the side, and he had the ether mask. And I looked at him, and there were my legs with my boots, one this way and that way, because my legs were separated from the femurs. The femurs had been shattered. There was no connection. And I tell you about things that you remember in your lifetime. I looked at those doctors, and I said, "Are you going to take my legs off?" And they said, "No, trooper, we don't think we are." And I said to them, "You're not bullshitting me, are you?" And they said, "No." I said, "Okay." And I took the ether mask, put it on myself, and I woke up, and the nurses were, I think, the most vile, incredible thing that I ever had in my life was being in that evac ward. people screaming, nurses running back and forth. It was chaos, absolute chaos. The nurse went running by, and I said, "Nurse, nurse." She stopped. I said, "Take those blankets off of my toes." I didn't know if I had any toes. So she picked up the blanket, moved it off my feet, and I had a plaster cast on from here all the way down, both legs. I saw those 10 toes, and I wiggled them. And I went back to sleep, I bet, for another half a day or something. And I'll remember the doctor holding the chunk of femur out of my leg. Now, this was done in the ward in the hospital in England. And it was dripping blood, and it was dripping like this. And he said, "What do you want to do with this?" And he was heading for the wastebasket. I said, "No, give it to me. I'll put it with my Purple Heart." Now, the first day I had my legs on the ground, my feet on the ground, I walked across the damn floor. Yeah, I had parallel bars that could support me, but I walked across that floor, and I went home on crutches 2 weeks later and left my crutches in a bar one night. That's the last time I had to use the crutches. Well, I wanted to be a mechanical engineer, and Marquette had an excellent engineering school, and so I matriculated there, and I subsequently graduated from there with a degree in mechanical engineering, and in the ensuing years met my wife at Marquette because I wanted to go to a Catholic school, and she was living in Milwaukee in those days. And the night before I went back to college, I spotted her across the dance floor, and 4 years later we were married. I've had an excellent, rewarding. Lord took care of me, and I get around very well, even though I do have a cane, but I can't complain.
We were to fly 35 missions. And at first they were giving you, if it's a long mission, they'd give you 2. But that never happened to me. I actually flew into enemy territory 50 times. 13 times were turnarounds, come back, the engines were quit, you couldn't make it. So I got 13 missions that I didn't have credit for. When I got to my 35th mission, I was asked by the commander, I was a captain then, "Why don't you stick around and fly?" Because he'd been flying with me as a co-pilot. That's how he got his flying in. He said, "I'll make you a major before you go home." So I flew 2 more missions. That was 37. Still didn't make major. 37th mission, I had a very good friend. It was his last mission, his 35th, and he got shot down. So I said, I quit. Now in my career as a combat pilot, on my 4th mission, I was called in by the base commander, and he said, you got a lot of flying time, 17s. I said, yes. He says, you trained in Langley Field as a lead pilot. I said, yes. He says, you're going to start leading on my 4th mission. On my 4th mission, I led the squadron, the 96th Squadron, into a place called Maribor, Czech Yugoslavia. And they said, we're going in 19,000 feet. There's no flak there. Somebody's wrong, because that was absolutely the first time I'd seen the fire, not just smoke from the flak. And they shot the heck out of us. We had over 200 holes in our airplane when we got back. From 1920 to 1930 was good days, flapper days and all that. Everybody had money. And then all of a sudden, everything falls apart. And we were all in a Great Depression. But every one of us, we were all in the same boat. So we really didn't know how bad it was, but it was bad. Thistles, grasshoppers, army worms. It was just terrible. Heat. For months we had just nothing but heat. So everything dried up. And it was tough days, but we got through it all right. And then my dad moved into a little town called Arnegard, a Norwegian community. In this Norwegian community, there were 3 families that weren't Norwegian. It was my family, which was Childs, which is English. My mother's side was Baumann, which was German. And then there was an Irish family. The rest were all Norwegians. So I learned how to eat lutefisk and lefse and all that stuff. I lived a half a block from a school, so I had to go. And I remember every teacher I had from the 1st grade to the time I graduated. They were all good teachers. I remember every one of them. I had an incident in every class for some reason, and so that's why I remember them. My main subject, of course, being music, and I was in singing and in the choirs, and I was always in the band because I was a drummer. I started playing drums when I was 8 years old, and I'm still playing drums at the age of 95. My first flight was in a bomb store. They'd come through the towns and they'd give you rides, and it was a Jenny, World War II Jenny. And I sat in the front seat with my dad, and that was my first flight. My brother and my cousins built an airplane, and they needed a pilot. So they put me in the airplane and pushed it down the hill, and the plane crashed because it didn't take off. And my mother was so angry. And I was 6 years old then, and that was my first plane crash. Then in 1927, Lindbergh went across the ocean, and that was a big thing. So I put 2 chairs up, and I sat with a blanket over me, and I flew the Atlantic Ocean day in, day out. Though I really flew it on instruments. I was sitting under the blanket. As a kid, I used to come running out when their airmail planes would fly over, and I would holler at them and wave at them. And so my interest in flying had always been there. Things got kind of tough. That I was in the middle. I always felt that nobody liked me. I had 2 sisters and a brother older, my 2 sisters younger. My mother was busy taking care of my younger sisters, and I was kind of left out in the boondocks, and I just thought they didn't like me. And so at the age of 14, I left home and jumped on a freight train and went to the West Coast. And then at the age of 15, I come back, went back to school. Age of 15, I'm back on the freight trains, back to school. 16, back on the freight trains. And my dad and mother never knew where I was at. My poor mother, she just wondered what's happening to that boy, where is he at? So I was gone all the time. I can remember the train whistling at night. When I hear a train now, I get that lonely feeling. And I was scared, but there was other kids along with us. There was a bunch of kids riding freight trains. And all of us got together and hung together. The hobos, they called them hobos, but the hobos were the men that were out looking for jobs to send money back home. And you had your bums and you had your tramps. So the tramps were the people that they lived. That was their life. You know, we had what we call a hobo jungle, and that's where everybody hung around, and they wouldn't let the bums come in because they didn't like them. My dad says, you're not riding freight trains anymore. You're staying home. You've got to straighten out your life. You're going to CMTC. CMTC was civilian military training. It was Army. We were dressed in Army uniforms. He says, maybe they'll straighten you out. So I joined a band because I was an excellent drummer, so I joined a band. This was in Bismarck, North Dakota, and a big train carnival came through. And I went down, a bunch of us went down to see the carnival. We were going up the Midway, and I heard all this noise, and I look up, and there's a little band up there beating the heck out of it, and some girlies out there dancing. I knew the musicians in the band, because I'd played with them when I was in dance bands. And they hollered at me, Leroy, we need a drummer. Well, the girl who played the piano in the group used to live at our house. She was a ranching girl, and she lived at her house in the wintertime, so she knew my dad well. And called my father and said they needed me. So he released me. I got an honorable discharge from the CMTC and joined the carnival and played the drums for the Girly Girly Show. My dad sent a wire and said, you better come home fast. You have to go to school anyhow, but your mother's dying. So I came home. I rode a freight train from Minneapolis to Bismarck, and I walked down to the hospital, and I must have been, skinny as a rail and dirty from the freight train. I didn't recognize my mother. She was just a skeleton. I don't know what she thought when she saw me. I flunked chemistry. You couldn't graduate without having all this. So they said, you flunked chemistry. So I just went down the highway and started hitchhiking. I was leaving town. And a young girl come running across the field and hollered at me. She says, Leroy, and everybody called me Leroy then. Chemistry teacher wants to see you. Chemistry teacher was a lady. She was in charge of all the music, and I used to sing solos with the groups and the dramatics. And she says, I'm going to give you another test. I'm going to ask you 2 questions. She asked me 2 questions that she knew that I knew the answer. She says, you passed. So I graduated from high school. That's the only way I did. Then I hitchhiked down and went to college with $19 in my pocket. I was playing in dance bands when I was going to college, and I was cleaning the floor in the auditorium. That's how it was. And so I joined the National Guard in 1940 to make some extra money. They paid you $2 if you went to a meeting. That was a lot of money. Well, February 1941, they blew the bugle, federalized the 164th Infantry in North Dakota. Now I'm in the infantry as a light machine gunner. And they moved us out of North Dakota to Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, where they had maneuvers all summer down there. And I was a buck private for a whole year, never made a stripe. I think I peeled more potatoes and did more latrine duty than anybody else. And I saw these airplanes flying, and I thought, hey, that's for me. So they had a sign up on the bulletin board they needed aviation cadets. So I applied. Well, I passed everything. Then they said you have to take a mental exam. Well, then I knew I was out because I'd never studied in college. So I thought, that's it. Have you had any college? I said, yes, got 3 years. You don't have to take the mental exam. So I was accepted as the aviation cadet. And I was already flying when Pearl Harbor started. We were all sitting around and we'd been flying, as cadets. And we were sitting around in the barracks and the radio was on. And Roosevelt was telling all about the disastrous deal that happened in Pearl Harbor. And I thought to myself, where's Pearl Harbor? I had no idea where Pearl Harbor was. But we found out this and everybody said, well, looks like we're going to war. Oh, I was a fighter pilot. Everything I went through was fighters. And when I graduated, single engine, then I got into P-40s. And I have a story to tell you that in Eglin Field, I was doing my gunnery practice as a cadet. And I saw this runway down there, and they had, right across the runway, had a big marker. And I saw these B-25s staggering off the ground. I thought, what in the world are they doing? Two weeks later, they hit Tokyo. So I saw Doolittle's group practicing. I graduated in July 3rd, 1942, from flying cadets. The next day, I married the girl from college. She came down on 4th of July. They didn't have any fireworks or anything on the 4th of July then because it was war. But I always say that I lost my independence on the 4th of July because I got married. My first assignment was instructing British cadets. So immediately I went into the training command. And I stayed in that darn training command, instructing. And then from there I went into B-25s and B-26s. And then the next thing you know, I'm flying B-17s and B-24s. And I'm instructing in them. And I thought, this is enough of this stuff. I want to go to combat. So on the bulletin board, they said they needed B-24 pilots to go to the South Pacific. So 2 o'clock in the morning, they took a picture of my wife and my baby and myself. I said goodbye at 6 o'clock in the morning, put us on a commercial aircraft. It was that important. Flew us to Fresno, California. We got there, and they said, what are you guys doing here? Nobody ever found the orders. Do you have any B-17 pilots in your group? Oh, yes. So then they sent me to Lincoln, Nebraska, and I picked up a crew, trained with the crew, and was headed for combat. My next stop was Langley Field. When I arrived there, they took my Navigator and my bombardier away from me. So here I am sitting with 8 men in the crew, just myself, co-pilot, and the rest of the enlisted men. I was called in by the commander. He says, Lieutenant, we need you here. You're more important as an instructor to stay on this base and instruct people in radar bombing. I said, that's not fair. About a week later, I was called in, and the commander says, your crew really thinks highly of you. I said, well, yes, we live together, we train together. He said, they have convinced me that you're the best pilot in the country, and they want you to be their pilot in combat so you can go. So then I went overseas with my crew. We left Langley Field, and they gave us our own airplane, a brand new airplane. Everybody had to name their planes. So I had a Democratic crew. And so I said, okay, guys, what do you want to name it? Gravel Gertie. Now, Gravel Gertie was a skinny, long-haired, blonde, homely woman on Dick Tracy's comics. So they picked Gravel Gertie. My wife wasn't too happy because she said most pilots had their wife's names. So our plane was Gravel Gertie. We took off at 2 o'clock in the morning, got up to 9,000 feet, called in, says we're headed across. They wished us luck. The radio operator picked up music, and it was a woman singing, I'll Be Seeing You. And here we're sitting there, headed for combat, with that beautiful singing voice, I'll be seeing you. And I was thinking, here are these guys all sitting in the back, sitting in that B-17 and listening to that music and thinking about their loved ones we were leaving. And so we flew across the Atlantic Ocean and looked down. There was water and water. One time I looked down, I saw this ship down there, and I thought, how in the world is that ship getting across that ocean by itself without being torpedoed? There's a little spot in the ocean called Azore Islands, and we hit that right on the head. That's the first time I ever landed on a mat runway. So when I landed, I thought I forgot to put my gear down because it was so noisy. And that was the Azore Islands. From there, we went to Morocco, and then we went to Malaysia, and we went into Sicily, and finally ended up in Italy and Foggia, and they took our airplane away from us. And we had babied that airplane. That was our plane. The next day, the plane was on a mission and was shot down. So we went to our base, which was 20 miles out of Foggia. Nothing but olive trees and mud, and we lived in tents. And in the wintertime, it was terrible because of the snow and mud. And that's where I flew 37 missions out of there. My first combat mission, I was really excited. We flew as a co-pilot with somebody who'd been flying combat, was a pro, I was all excited watching that flak come up. I thought, man, this is combat. This is something to see. I'm looking at the flak coming up, paying more attention to that than watching everything's going on. I was all excited about my first mission. I thought that was really something to see. Well, second mission wasn't so good, and the third and the fourth. From then on, I found out what combat was all about, but the first mission was exciting to me. We had long missions, like Bleckenhammer. That was an oil factory. It was 650 miles from our base to Bleckenhammer, and 650 miles back. So we had long missions. But we went in and bombed fighter bases, marshalling yards, which was railroads, awful lot of fuel. We bombed many oil factories and stuff. So we had a lot of cleaning up to do down there where the 18th Air Force couldn't reach. And so we were busy. We were to fly 35 missions. And at first they were giving you, if it's a long mission, they'd give you 2. But that never happened to me. I actually flew into enemy territory 50 times. 13 times were turnarounds, come back, the engines were quit, you couldn't make it. So I got 13 missions that I didn't have credit for. When I got to my 35th mission, I was asked by the commander, I was a captain then, why don't you stick around and fly? Because he'd been flying with me as a co-pilot. That's how he got his flying in. He said, I'll make you a major before you go home. So I flew 2 more missions. That was 37. Still didn't make major. 37th mission, I had a very good friend. It was his last mission, his 35th, and he got shot down. So I said, I quit. Now, in my career as a combat pilot, on my 4th mission, I was called in by the base commander, and he said, you got a lot of flying time, 17s. I said, yes. He says, you trained in Langley Field as a lead pilot. I said, yes. He says, you're going to start leading on my 4th mission. In my 4th mission, I led the squadron, the 96th Squadron, into a place called Maribor, Czech Yugoslavia. And they said, we're going in 19,000 feet. There's no flak there. Well, somebody's wrong, because that was absolutely the first time I'd seen the fire, not just smoke from the flak. And they shot the heck out of us. We had over 200 holes in our airplane when we got back. We lost an engine, and it broke off, and we couldn't feather it, so it was out there just flying by itself. And the only way we could get rid of it was we pulled the throttles back, put the flaps down, climb, and it just like a brake, and the prop would fly off because it was flying free. And that was the way we get rid of those props. So that was a tough mission. And then after that, I ended up flying 20 leads. squadron, and then I went to group lead. In my crew, my engineer was shot. He was killed. My co-pilot was seriously wounded. My radio operator was seriously wounded, and the waist gunner was seriously wounded. And I came back alive. We were kids. We had a lot of friends who were going down around us. You'd see a plane here and a plane there blow up and that. We never knew the next day if we were going to get back or not. We had a dance band over there, a jazz band, and I was playing drums with it. We'd come back from a mission, get something to eat. We'd go to one of the enlistment clubs, and we'd play till 2 o'clock in the morning and drink that terrible cognac and juice. Next morning, I'd go on a mission, and I'd put 100% oxygen on to clear my head before I'd take off. Yeah, I was scared at times, but I guess we were just kids. I flew back one time in Blackhammer, went in, and the colonel was flying, and I was flying on his wing. They call it deputy lead. And when he crossed, his bombardier didn't quite get set up, so we got flak came up and knocked my engine out. And we had went around and come back in the second time, which wasn't good. They were really ready for us then. Dropped their bombs, and they knocked out my second engine. So there goes the formation, and I'm dropping back. All of a sudden, I'm up over Blackhammer, Germany, 650 miles from my base, all by myself with my crew. That was it. And we struggled to get back. I had a new Navigator that had never flown with me before, and he gave me a heading, and I looked at this heading, and he was taking me to Switzerland, where we could be interned the rest of the war. I told the boys, I said, Mike, my co-pilot, Mike and I think we can get you out of enemy territory where we can bail out. I said, we don't want to go to Switzerland. Nope. Okay. I think we can get over the Alps. Well, we flew through the Alps because I didn't have enough power to stay above them. I said, there's the Adriatic Sea. We can ditch. Or we can go to Vis, which was an English base where people would go to crash land. I said, I can see the Italian coast. I said, we can make it there and bail out. I said, hey, I see our base. I think we can make it. We flew over the tent area about 1,000 feet with 2 engines out and everybody looking up at us. And we were about 2 hours behind the regular formation that had landed. I was all set up for the landing. My 3rd engine quit. I had 1 engine left, so I can tell everybody I landed a B-17 on 1 engine. Just a story, but I did land on 1 engine. But got the Distinguished Flying Cross for that mission. In the wintertime, we couldn't fly because it was so bad. So they'd send up what they call the Lone Wolf mission, which they'd take 1 airplane from each squadron, and you'd fly up on instruments just to let the Germans know we were still around. And it was 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'm up over Germany on instruments, and the radar navigator says, our radar's out. I said, what do you mean? He said, we don't have any radar. I'm up over enemy territory on instruments and no radar, no way to get home. So I just turned it around 180 degrees, went in and landed and just got to sleep, and the squadron commander's shaking me, waking me up. He called me a coward. I said, why? He said, you came back. I said, why don't you go check the radar and see? Well, he did, and he found out it was out. But you know, that guy never apologized to me for that. I says, give me the next one. So 2 days later, flew up there, and when we got over the target, the weather cleared. Man, the flak was coming up, and fighters are coming up. So I dropped the bombs, and we headed for the clouds, and they chased us, and I kept flying in the clouds, and came home and got my second DFC for that one. So in northern Italy, they still had the German troops were up there in northern Italy. And the Fifth Army and the British Army were trying to keep them from escaping. So the last two missions, 15th Air Force was directed to go up there and stop those troops from escaping. I quit flying and got on a boat and went home, and then the war was over. That's how 15th Air Force finished, was to just get those German troops from escaping and going back into Germany. I met a B-24 pilot on the way back, and we become very close friends. And in New Jersey, we get off the boat, and they had a train, of course, it was heading for Minneapolis. I was the ranking officer, so they made me train commander, and I was supposed to keep those guys straight and level, you know. I just let them have a ball. I never stopped anybody from doing anything. The train was wonderful. We got to Minneapolis, and our wives met us. He had a young wife, and my wife. And we had a nice time that evening and out. 9 months later, they had a daughter, and I had a son, 2 days apart. We should have named them Minneapolis and Champaign, because that's the way it ended up. Exactly 2 days apart. I just came back. I was real excited because I had orders to fly B-36s. And that to me was something else. And when I got back to go to 36s, the guy I was with, he went to 36s, and they changed my orders and put me in a ferry command. And what I did then was fly these beat-up airplanes from all over the United States, and we just go get them and fly them and go back and fly another one and get on an airplane and bump somebody off, because our orders were number one priority. And that's what I did for some time. And then 3 years later, the Berlin Airlift hit. I was flying against the enemy. And 3 years later, I was flying for the enemy against the Russians. Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill got together. They knew the war was about over, and they decided, what are we going to do with Germany? So there was a decision they were going to divide Germany up into sectors. American sector, British sector, Russian sector. Well, what about the French? And Stalin said, that's fine, but take it out of your sector, not mine. So then Roosevelt died, and poor old Truman comes along, and he's got the whole world on his shoulder. Truman had maybe 2 or 3 meetings with Roosevelt. He never knew anything about the atomic bomb. He knew nothing about what was going on over in Europe. And so they had a meeting, and it was Truman, Stalin, and Churchill, where they decided to divide up into 3 sectors. And then Berlin was the city that they divided up into 3 sectors. And fortunately, the only airport in Berlin, Tempelhof, was in the Allied, in our sector. So what happened then, Stalin wanted to take over the world. He definitely wanted to have Europe. So he decided the only way you could do that was blockade, starve the West Berliners out, and make them come over to the East Berlin. And before that, when they went into Berlin, the Russians, they took everything out of Berlin that they could take and shipped it back to Russia. And the Mongolian troops came in, and they had free run of all the women. They raped hundreds and thousands of German women, West Berlin women. They'd take the faucets out of the apartment and take it home thinking they could hook it up and they'd have running water. You know, that's how dumb they were. Stalin said, okay. So he blockaded all the trains, all the trucks, and all the planes that came in on the water. But they had set up a corridor. There was a corridor flying in from southern. There's a corridor flying in from the northern part, and there's a corridor flying out of Tempelhof. And that was written in stone. Well, when he did that, General Clark and Truman said, we'll fly the food in. And of course, Stalin laughed at him, thinking that would never happen. They first started with C-47s, and they just had a mess up there. They had no control of the planes. They were coming in, and they were stacked and trying to get in. And C-47s could only handle about 3,000 tons, so we were supposed to get about 5,000 tons of food in a day. And they couldn't do it. So they brought in C-54s from all over. And I was called up. I was flying out of Washington, D.C. in C-54s, and I was called up and went over to fly in C-54s, and we could carry 10 tons. So for 11 solid months, we flew food into Berlin, day and night. Airplane landed every 3 minutes an airplane would land, and every 3 minutes a plane would take off. I was told to take off at a certain time. I better be there taking off at a certain time. I was supposed to be over here at a certain time. I better be there. When we flew over a place called Fulda, the radio place, that's when we entered the Russian zone. We had to be there exactly on time. There had to be an airplane 3 minutes ahead of us, and we'd listen. When he'd call in, 3 minutes later, we had to be there. We had to be at our altitude. And flying down that corridor, there were 45 airplanes at all times in that corridor flying. There were 5,500, 6,000, 6,500, and 7. And it was just like a conveyor belt. It's just constant. And those airplanes in there all the time. Then the Russians come up and they'd fly at us with their jets, and fire above us, fire below us, put up balloons, and at nighttime they put searchlights in their eyes. We had 700 and some incidents from the Russians on that corridor flying in, but we just kept flying. They brought in the best radar ground control approach guys that you could get. They had these shacks set up at the end of the runway, and then we were on solid instruments, and they'd say, okay, we've got you, no communication, just listen to us. And they had us on a blip, and they say, okay, you're on the glide path, you get a little high, why don't you just bring it down? You're going to the left a little bit, bring it back over. And we just sit back there like we were in a rocket chair and did what they told us to do. Had all the confidence in the world in them. After the war, all the German people had nothing. They didn't have a government. They didn't have homes. They didn't have food. 2 o'clock in the morning, Stalin would turn the lights on electricity on for 2 hours. Then he shut it off. And all the rest of the day, they had no electricity, no heat. They were starving to death and freezing to death, and they had nothing. But I have to say this, if it wasn't for the West Berlin people, we would never accomplish the Berlin Airlift, because they said, we do not want anything to do with communism, and we will stick with you. And they came and they worked with us. They unloaded our airplanes. The minute I stopped that airplane, the door opened there. The truck was right there. And there were 10 guys, 10 Germans, come in and started unloading. They had a contest between them. And one time they unloaded those airplanes. One time they unloaded 10 tons of coal in 10 minutes. The first time I landed and I stepped out of my cockpit, and this great big German come up to me and he shook my hand, and he was dirty, filthy cold, He had tears in his eyes. And he says, Dankeschön, Dankeschön. Then I knew why I was there. And if it hadn't been for the West Berliners, who decided they were going to stick it out with us, I don't think we'd ever been successful. We lost 31 airmen, and the British lost quite a few. There were 71 people killed on the Berlin Airlift. Elected me president, and I was 94 years old. And I said, you guys are nuts. You better have a good vice president, because like Roosevelt, I can die in office, And We have a reunion every year, and our reunion this year is in Oklahoma City, and it's the 25th reunion. I try to keep it alive, and everybody else, I give many speeches about it. And it's got to be kept alive. The Berlin Airlift, to West Berlin, people just, man, they see us and they put their arms around us, they cry. There was a little lady, an elderly lady, old, not as old as I am, but she was elderly, came up to me and she had a book and she was showing it to me. And so I was looking at it and she was crying. The next thing you know, I had tears running out of my eyes. And there was cameras all around taking pictures of me. Here I'm standing there crying with this Berlin Airlift lady. It was quite emotional because we really did something great when we saved their lives. There's no doubt about it.
Anyway, when we got to Guam, I think that was on the 17th of February, and we flew our first mission on the 25th. And that happened to be a daylight mission, and the idea was to fly formation all the way up to the Japanese coast and back, or at least all the way up and over the target. I think there were 330 B-29s on that particular raid, and we each dropped 40 500-pound bomb, incendiary bombs. So I don't think that I could persuade anybody. Certainly wars don't solve anything. They're terrible things. I think anybody that's ever been involved in a war, killing is a messy thing. It's certainly not exhilarating, or it's nothing to pursue.
The generation of Americans which fought and won World War II was made up of the children of the Great Depression. As they reached high school and university age, they didn't imagine they would be further called on to meet the greatest challenge our liberty, indeed our national existence, has ever faced. During the years the United States was engaged in the war, 1941 to 1945, 16 million of them, more than 10% of the entire population of the country at that time, wore the uniform of the armed forces. Very few, if any, American families were untouched by the most devastating conflict in human history. The challenge was met. Then our young men and women returned home to foster a season of prosperity, progress, and peace, unmatched in history. 16 million came together in a common cause, but their individual journeys were unique. With each voice that goes silent, we lose another report, another singular interpretation of the events of World War II. According to U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs statistics, only 558,000 of the 16 million Americans who served in World War II were alive in 2017. Richard Donaldson, who flew 35 missions as pilot of a Boeing B-29 Superfortress, is one of them.
My name is Richard Donaldson. I was born on March 6, 1923. And I go to the Veterans Administration for my medical needs now, and in that place, you're almost known by your date of birth. And I frequently kind of mumble over the original date by saying 1823 just to check and see if the nurses are listening. Graduated from high school in 1941 and had matriculated at Carleton College and was there when Pearl Harbor occurred. Part of my duties there and working out my tuition was waiting on tables in the girls' dormitory. It was on a Sunday, and we had eaten our meal after we'd finished serving the girls, and from that point on, all of us knew that we were prime targets to be in the military because we were just the right age. I did not go into the military until the middle of my sophomore year, but I had talked to a cousin of mine who was a good friend of mine about what we would do in our military service, and we both agreed that we wanted to fly because at least most Air Force pilots could come back and have clean sheets in the bed that they slept in at night instead of sleeping in a muddy trench like the soldiers did in World War I. We had agreed we both wanted to go right away into the service, and we found out that at the age of 19, which we both were, we had to have our parents' consent in order to go into the service right immediately. And he got his parents to sign off, and I couldn't get mine. They didn't want me to go any sooner than I'd have to. He was called in January of 1943, and I was put in the Air Corps Reserve, which would have deferred me until my college class graduated in 1945. Well, in February of 43, they decided to call all the Air Force Reserve all over the country into the service. So I was called in February. So not having my parents' permission amounted to only about 5 or 6 weeks that I was delayed in going into the service. And I was inducted into the service down at Jefferson Barracks right out of St. Louis.
At Jefferson Barracks, Dick Donaldson entered the service in the oldest operating U.S. military installation west of the Mississippi River. It was built in 1826 and is used as a base for the Army and the Air National Guard to this day. Richard was not the first member of his family to go there.
And it turned out that was the same place my dad had been inducted in World War I. And I had a great-grandfather that was stationed right outside of Jefferson Barracks in the Civil War. But it was a horrible place to be. It was hot in the summer and cold in the winter. And this was in the spring, early spring of February of 43. And they put us in huts that were 16-foot square. There were 8 of us in each hut, and no insulation, no lining, and it was almost zero temperatures. And we had one stove in the middle, and they put a 5-gallon pail of water right next to it. And on normal mornings, that would be frozen solid. We all got colds, and we all wanted to get out of St. Louis, I remember.
But Richard Donaldson and his fellow recruits weren't going to be leaving St. Louis just yet. Like so many American institutions, colleges all across the country were incorporated into the war effort in those days. And one of them was Washington University in St. Louis.
And we all wanted to come back up in the upper Midwest where we'd been from to go to college But instead of that, they loaded us on a truck that took us into Washington University in St. Louis. So I ended up with another 5 months in St. Louis that I wasn't looking forward to. We went to school there and at the university, and we had professors that were very good. We took mathematics from how to count from 1 to 10 up through spherical trig and all kinds of college classes.
Richard's class next would go to Santa Ana Army Air Base in Costa Mesa, California. It was an anomaly, a 1,300-acre air base with no hangars, planes, or runways. The first buildings were completed in May of 1942. It became a huge base for receiving air cadets from civilian life and giving them basic ground training prior to attending one of the contract primary aviation schools for flight training.
But anyway, we got out to Santa Ana, and there were 700 of us in the class. And there were, I think, 60,000 on the base. From the Santa Ana base, where we were determined, we took tests to see whether we should become a pilot, a navigator, or a bombardier. Everybody, of course, wanted to stay in the pilot training.
These men are aviation cadets. In the near future, they will have learned many things. How to pilot a plane, how to navigate, or how to operate a bomb site.
These are the fighting men of the United States Army Air Force.
Among the country's great accomplishments during World War II was the building and training of the greatest air force in the world. From the Air Corps of 1939, with 20,000 men and 2,400 planes, to the Army Air Forces of 1944, with almost 2.4 million personnel and 80,000 aircraft, it was a nearly miraculous expansion. One of the key components of the program was the primary training of thousands of enlisted pilots through civilian contract schools. One such contract school was operated by the Palo Alto, California School of Aviation at the King City Airport. It was the next stop for Richard Donaldson.
And King City had been a private flight training base. So when we got there, all of our instructors were civilians. And where we normally got paid $75 a month, which was the base pay for a cadet at that time, they gave us $275 at the head of a pay line, and we walked down and paid off for our room and our board and so forth, and ended up with $75. With the civilian instructors, it was so much easier than it would be with the military, which we found out when they moved us to basic training in Chico, California. Then we were back in the Army again.
At the 1,045-acre Chico, California airport, which the City Council leased to the War Department for $1 a year, cadets encountered the infamous BT-13, the Vultee vibrator.
When we got to basic, we flew that BT-13, which you also have up there. The Vultee vibrator, we called it. When you got into as you were approaching a stall and got just ready to stall out, it started to vibrate. And it would very easily fall into a spin. And it was very difficult to get out of a spin once they got in one. So more than one cadet over the years spun right into the ground, not being able to get it out of there. But fortunately, I didn't have that problem. Also in basic training is where we first did any night flying. And that just scared the dickens out of us. It was scary enough flying an airplane that you weren't familiar with, but then to fly it at night was doubly so.
In the months preceding World War II, the U.S. Army entered into the first of many lease agreements with the city of Stockton to construct and operate an Army training facility and airfield at Stockton Municipal Airport. It became known as the home of the Army Air Corps Advanced Flying School.
From then on, we went to advanced training down at Stockton, California. And that was with a twin-engine airplane. It was a Cessna 17. We called it double-breasted Cub or the bamboo bomber, or all kinds of names. I remember I had wanted to fly a twin-engine airplane, but I wanted a P-38, which was a fighter airplane, where you'd fly alone and much more maneuverable and so forth. The brass answered that by saying we are no longer in a defensive war. We're now in an offensive war, so we don't need fighter pilots anymore. We want very heavy bomber pilots. So we were relegated to flying bombers at that point. So when we graduated from advanced, I was assigned to go to B-24 training school at Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I think we were there for 9 weeks, long enough to learn how to spell Albuquerque anyway.
The Consolidated B-24 Liberator was an American heavy bomber designed by Consolidated Aircraft of San Diego. With nearly 19,000 built, over 8,000 by Ford Motor Company, it holds records as the world's most produced bomber, multi-engine aircraft, and American military aircraft in history. The Ford plant at Willow Run, Michigan famously built one of the bombers every hour.
So anyway, after finishing B-24 school, this was what they called a B-24 first pilot school. By then, under normal conditions, you would they'd assign a crew to you and you go overseas. But in my case, they were looking for pilots for B-29 training, so I was picked to go to that, and I fought the Battle of Kansas, which is where we were training at Great Bend, Kansas.
The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was another huge technological advancement brought about by the war effort. It was the single most expensive weapons project undertaken by the United States in World War II, exceeding the cost of the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb, by between $1 and $1.7 billion. The B-29 was the first airplane designed and built after the war began. Its innovations were jaw-dropping. Though it was huge, with a wingspan of over 141 feet, a length of 99 feet, and a height of nearly 3 stories, it was the first plane to be completely pressurized. Its 11-man crew was able to fly in comfort at altitudes above 30,000 feet without the bulky flying suits and individual oxygen tanks previously required. An analog computer-controlled system directed 4 remote machine gun turrets that could be operated by a single gunner and a fire control officer. A manned tail gun installation was semi-remote.
And they had an awful time shooting down a B-29 because we had this remote gunnery system. Because of the fact we were pressurized, we couldn't have guns projecting through a window like a B-17 or a B-24. So they had remote firing aiming systems remote from the actual guns. And we had twin 50 caliber guns on 4 different stations, 2 on top and 2 on the bottom, plus tail gunner had his own guns. There were sighting stations on either side of the waist and on top of the waist, and also up in the nose from the bombardier.
With 4 2,200 horsepower radial engines, the B-29 could fly more than 350 miles per hour for over 4,000 miles. Its speed and its 31,000-foot operating ceiling were its best defense. Japanese fighters could barely attain that altitude, and if they did, it could not match the speed. The Superfortress could deliver 20,000 pounds of bombs.
We went to Fremont, Nebraska, where they issued all of our overseas clothing and guns and so forth. And then we flew from there to Sacramento and stayed overnight and flew then to Hawaii. And that's when, on the flight to Hawaii, we opened our orders to find out where we were going and found out it was to Guam.
The island of Guam was a symbol of the ebb and flow of the Pacific theater of World War II. A United States possession since its capture from Spain in 1898, it was captured by the Japanese in December of 1941, just 3 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor. In a horrendous battle to retake the island in July and August of 1944, 1,777 Americans were killed and 5,798 were wounded. 18,337 Japanese were killed. And when the battle ended, the U.S. and its allies had the B-29 bomber base they sought in order to launch strikes against the Japanese home islands. The 19th Bombardment Group was activated at Great Bend Army Airfield in Kansas on April 4, 1944. It was ordered to Guam on the 16th of January 1945. On Guam, the 19th was assigned to the 314th Bomber Wing of the 20th Air Force's 21st Bomber Command.
Anyway, when we got to Guam, I think that was on the 17th of February, and we flew our first mission on the 25th. And that happened to be a daylight mission, and the idea was to fly formation all the way up to the Japanese coast and back, or at least all the way up and over the target. And we found out right away that the weather always changes. There's always at least one front between Guam and Japan, and that's where the two air masses meet, and you get a lot of bad weather, rain, and we were flying formation at relatively low altitude, I think about 2,000 feet or so, and we ran into that first front, and right away you couldn't see the airplane on either side of him. So we had to fly in the blind all the rest of the way up to Japan and finally climb up to our bombing altitude, which was happened to be 28,000 feet, where we broke out between two cloud masses. And we'd always heard that the Japanese were not nearly as good with anti-aircraft as the Germans were. And the first burst of anti-aircraft fire that I saw was right square in front of our nose. And the next one was one off either wing and one off the tail, and I thought, well, these guys are pretty good. But fortunately, they never fired the next one because they didn't hit us anyway. We dropped our bombs by radar. And it was really a kind of a mess. There were airplanes all over the place. And we discovered the jet stream. I think no one had ever heard of the jet stream before that. And that's a very strong current of air that comes off the Asian mainland. And they'd clocked it up to as high as 225 miles an hour. And we found out that if we were going downwind with that, we were going so fast that we couldn't crank in the bomb sight in order to bomb. And if we were going upwind, we almost were standing still. So it was a big factor in the fact that we had to end up bombing from much lower altitudes than we were originally intended to bomb from. So we had a general in charge of us that had been in the 8th Air Force out of England and had witnessed the English bombing incendiaries at night. So he decided that our best bet was to use incendiary bombs and bomb from lower altitudes, which would be all the way from 5,000 to about 10,000 feet. We were appalled by the idea of doing that because we felt we were well within the range of any gun that the Japanese would have had, maybe even their shotguns at that altitude, and well within the range of their fighters and so forth. On the 9th of March, we flew our first incendiary raid against Tokyo, and I think there were 330 B-29s on that particular raid. And we each dropped 40 500-pound incendiary bombs. These bombs were composed of 28 sticks. They were about 3 feet long, and they had a detonator on either end, and it was filled with napalm. When you dropped the 500-pound cluster, that was set to explode at about 2,000 feet. And then from that, the individual sticks spread out. And whenever they hit, they would hit one end or the other, and that would explode that stick. And that napalm, which is a jellied gas, would fly any place and stick to whatever. And it burned at such a high temperature, it would melt almost any steel structure or machinery or anything. So, and of course, the Japanese buildings were almost all built out of wood. So it was very effective against them. We knew that, I think in that first raid, we bombed out about 16 square miles of the city of Tokyo. And the estimate was it was about 100,000 civilians were killed. We were very concerned about that. Not as much as I am now, I guess, because we were full of the desire to beat and kill Japanese people. But we were aware of the fact that we were a signatory to the Geneva Conventions, which stipulated that you should not target civilians. And here we were targeting civilians. And we found out later, that almost everybody did that.
World War II brought the first widespread use of strategic bombing against cities and their civilian populations. During the lead-up to the war, in 1937, the Japanese were among the first to do it. Its Imperial Air Force conducted widespread civilian bombing during its attempt to subjugate China.
I know I have feelings almost every day about the fact that did much damage to 67 cities in Japan during the time that I was there, and killed more civilians than all the military losses Japan suffered in the entire war. The B-29s had also dropped, mines in the harbors to where they couldn't supply themselves with shipping even. So they were almost starving to death. And we found out later many of the Japanese military wanted to prevail and continue the war, feeling that if they made the landings which we felt would be necessary, if they made those difficult enough, they could get a better settlement, and the terms of their peace would be much better. As I don't think they could have gotten much better than their terms were. But anyway, that was a big problem in Japan, trying to decide what to do, because I think they knew that they were defeated. Okay, this is a picture of our airplane and the entire crew. This is Hans Gamble, Harry Peter Neil Gamble III.
Dick Donaldson went on to fly 35 missions to Japan in the B-29. He seems as connected to his airplane and the crew he flew with, he's the last surviving crew member, as he was the day he left Guam.
I flew my 35th mission on the 1st of August, and on the 6th of August they dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and I was on my way home at that point. I was en route between Guam and Inuitak, I think it was, on flying ATC.
Dick started home from the theater as he had arrived, by air. He and his Navigator were first flown to Hawaii by the Air Transport Command.
And we finally got the Navigator and I got back to Hawaii on the way home, and there they took us off the Air Transport Command because they wanted to save the ATC planes to fly prisoners of war that would be released when they knew that the signing of the peace treaty was imminent, and they wanted to be able to get those people and fly them back as quickly as they could. So we were left there without any way to get back to the States. And there was a troop ship coming all the way from the Philippines. They didn't want to stop long enough in Hawaii to put on stores, but we did. We were able to get aboard, and because of the fact that they didn't take on more supplies, we had to go on a rationing of 2 meals a day. Anyway, finally, I think it took us. We flew overseas from Sacramento to Hawaii in 10 hours, and it took us 12 days to get back by ship. And the skipper of the ship didn't believe, he was worried that there would be Japanese submarines around that didn't know about the peace treaty yet, so he zigzagged all the way back, and that's what took us so long.
After 12 days, the ship got back to harbor in San Francisco just after 10 p.m. when the harbor had closed. The ship had to be inspected, and the inspector was not willing to come out until morning. Since the troops had already cleaned the ship, the captain would not let them go below decks for the night.
And at 7 o'clock in the morning, we were the first troop ship back after the end of the war, and they had a tugboat come out from shore with a whole bunch of girls and a band and welcome home, you know. Here we'd been standing on the deck of that ship all night long, you know. We weren't too happy about being welcomed home in that way, but anyway, it was quite an experience. And that was the end of the war for me.
In some ways, it's fair to ask if the war ever ends for the ones who have to fight it. Carl Melantes, who was awarded the Navy Cross for Valor, wrote, "When the peace treaty is signed, the war isn't over for veterans or the family. It's just starting." Certainly, there are the memories.
We were assigned to go down to Cuba for a week's overwater navigation training over the Gulf of Mexico. And we were short of B-29, so we were assigned to B-17 to fly down there. Anyway, we were flying out over the Gulf of Mexico at night, and we got an engine fire on our number 4 engine. And we did just about everything we could to put out that fire. Anyway, we were just getting ready to bail out over the Gulf at night when the fire burned the bolts that mounted it on the wing, and it fell off into the ocean or into the Gulf of Mexico. So we just flew the airplane back and landed under normal conditions. We were very fortunate there. And one night we took off. There had been thunderstorms in the area that night. Right after we left the ground, we were kind of in the clouds. And the first thing I noticed was our bombardier, who sat right in front of us, said, "What the?" And all of a sudden, our landing lights were retracting and we hit some trees. And it was right at the edge of the cliff. And so we went over the cliff, and we had I think we bent up about 4 feet to the right wingtip, and we had every prop had at least one blade that had coral necks in it. So here we were off that cliff and in the dark, and we had 500 feet and we'd be in the ocean, and we were in a turn to the right because of that bent right wingtip. So right away I had to toggle the bomb switch, or a switch that released the bombs into the ocean, and that gave us enough lift to where we came back and missed the cliff on the way back. And we landed at another field because there were airplanes still taking off from ours. They ended up, I had to sign a statement of charges for the airplane commander, and I had to sign for a $600,000 airplane.
There are the memories, and there are the feelings.
Well, as I mentioned before, I was very concerned about the targeting of civilians. But anyway, I find that, everything that has happened in warfare since World War II, civilians are almost the only target. So I don't think, it's something that's out of our control now. Okay, after I was discharged, I went back and finished my college education. I met a girl there that I married, came back here and started in the lumber business. My grandfather and my great-grandfather had started the coal business in Tracy in 1894. And my dad had bought out my great-grandfather, I think in 1936. Some of the experiences I'd had in various places, I had originally intended to graduate from Carleton College with an econ degree and go to Harvard and get a master's in business administration and take on New York City. But I had decided that the life in the bigger cities didn't appeal to me as much as the smaller towns. So I had written my dad that I was thinking of coming back to Tracy, and that since we had that lumberyard physically, the plant there, I might start a lumber business to go along with the coal business, because that was kind of phasing out anyway. So that's what we did. During the time that we were starting that and running it, I raised 3 children and sent them all to college and graduate school. And then at the age of 60, my oldest son came back and was going to take over the family business. So I was casting around for something to do, and my wife and I decided to join the Peace Corps. And we spent 4 years, 2 years in Jamaica and 2 years in Barbados. I learned that the best way for happiness is to feel that you're helping people. And when you're in the Peace Corps and working with people that are having problems in third world countries, you think you're helping them. Whether you actually are or not, I guess doesn't really make any difference as long as you think so. So to me, it was a very satisfying experience. It was a life-altering type of experience. Certainly, wars don't solve anything. They're terrible things. I think anybody that's ever been involved in a war would decry anybody else getting involved in one. Killing is a messy thing. It's certainly not exhilarating, or it's nothing to pursue.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks' Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth, and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Superfortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the DroneScapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.